Spotify's list is more of an accurate reflection of what the passive majority listens to, whereas YouTube is more of a reflection of what people are actively fans of and actively engaging with. Which is interesting because that was a question that we asked in our last episode where we were like, how do we measure, like, what are new ways to measure consumption? And I said, well, it'd be interesting if we could actually measure, active consumption versus passive. And now here, looking at these two lists, I was like, oh, this is actually potentially an example of that.
All right, today we have Tati Cirasano back with us from MIDiA Research, and we're going to dive into the billions playlists that are both from Spotify and YouTube. What a fascinating list. It's like a trip down memory lane, telling you what songs are popular, but also how these lists are different. I feel like they both have somewhere between like 300 to 400 songs, but there's a whole bunch of different trends here. I know that we both have a bunch of notes here, but Tati, I'll start with you. What stuck out to you most when you were looking through these lists earlier?
Oh my gosh, so there's so many things. I guess I'll start with the things that stuck out to me that don't have to do with differences, but just stuck out to me in terms of just looking at both. And one was that I felt like there was definitely a dominance of songs and artists from the last decade and maybe even just the last 5 years, which was interesting to me because, there's been such a debate recently about is old music or what we call catalog, which is often not actually old music, but is it sort of cannibalizing new music? Does new music have more to compete with? And that whole argument. So it was interesting to see that there actually weren't that many on either, or weren't relatively as many older songs. I believe the YouTube Billion Views Club had like one song from the 70s. And I think that it makes more sense with YouTube. And I think YouTube had even more dominance with more recent songs. And that kind of makes sense because if it's visual based, maybe some of these songs we don't have the music videos, or maybe they're not as good. But I thought that was interesting just off the bat from both
Yeah,
lists.
I would agree. I think that YouTube's list did trend much younger, and there's a whole MTV effect of just what music videos look
Yeah.
like then and now. But I also feel like what's important is with both Spotify and YouTube that when these platforms accelerated in growth, a lot of the artists that were releasing music around those times accelerated in growth too. And I feel like I saw some trends there. If I think about YouTube and its rapid growth phase more so in the early 2010s, there were a few songs there that I saw, whether it's like a party rock anthem or songs like that, that streamed really well on YouTube, still nowhere near a billion streams on Spotify. And I think on the flip side of that, on Spotify, there were a few songs that were in that late 2010s era that Spotify was in its rapid growth phase that weren't on
Mhm.
YouTube's playlist. So that was one of those interesting things. Like, for example, I think Drake's song "Nice for What" a billion streams on it's a billion streams on Spotify. It's in the Billions Club, but it wasn't on YouTube's list. And I remember that music video. I think it's in the
Mhm.
skating rink, and he has like Issa Rae and all these people in it. So there was definitely some influence from the platforms too.
Yeah. And that reminds me too of with the influence of platforms, it felt like on both platforms, I felt like there were a lot of songs that were driven by like a viral hit or a novelty, which kind of just goes to show how embedded music has become in like meme culture and social media, and just like online culture in general. But it also, like, looking at the differences within that, it felt like this is like, I mean, you need to do more of a real like study and look at the actual numbers on this, but just from scrolling over the list, it seemed like more of the TikTok traffic is going to
Hmm.
Spotify. Like the songs that there were a lot of songs that had a billion streams, that I just remember being moments on TikTok, like Dreams and the Roses Iman Beck remix, like those songs and many others had passed a billion streams on Spotify, but had not cracked the YouTube list. And then on the flip side, YouTube had a lot of stuff that was more uh, like just these memes about I'm trying to think of an example, like the Dame Tu Cositas song and video, like that. There were actually an abundance of songs on the Billion Views Club for YouTube that were linked to these videos, including dancing
I
frogs. Like
saw
that
that.
was just like that was a moment in time in meme culture that kind of preceded TikTok humor. I don't know, like you can almost track meme culture's impact based on these two platforms lists as
That's
well.
a
With TikTok driving more traffic to Spotify and sort of the old, almost like Vine humor going more to
that point makes
YouTube.
me think of two things I also saw as well. So I believe the first YouTube video that hit a billion streams was Psy's Gangnam Style. I don't think that song has a billion
Yes.
streams or anywhere close to that on Spotify's list, which I think speaks to your point about just the visual nature of that. And that, of course, was a pre TikTok era. Um, the other song I think that lines up with this a bit, and this is because of memes within the music video itself, is Nelly and Kelly Rowland's Dilemma music video. That is the most popular YouTube video
Mm-hmm.
that Nelly has, and I'm pretty sure that Kelly Rowland likely has too. And it's because of this one scene in the music video where Kelly is texting on this 2002's phone, and she has
Right.
Microsoft
Right.
Excel
Iconic.
open, and that's what she's actually using to text. So they're both,
Classic. Yeah.
generating money. And Kelly was even talking about in an interview semi recently, talking about, I didn't even know what Microsoft Excel was. They just told me to type, but over time, and now we obviously have a different relationship with texting. That type of event can blow up on YouTube in a way that it's not necessarily gonna on Spotify.
Right. Like there's an inherent difference in just how you where what you're going to do on these platforms. Like you can go there's a number of reasons why you might look up a music video on YouTube. Maybe you like the song, maybe there's a celebrity cameo, maybe somebody told you that it's a crazy wild video and you're just curious. Like there's a lot more reasons I think than there are reasons why you would stream a song. So that just by definition kind of opens up a lot of differences in these
The
lists.
other thing too that you mentioned earlier was the decades and how YouTube's list only had one song. I think that was before 1980, and there was only a handful, even from the 80s and the 90s as well. And while Spotify had a bit more, I still think it was quite less. Last time I looked at Spotify's list, it was less than 10% of the 300 plus songs that were more than 20 years old. And I have to assume YouTube may be even closer to 94, 95%. Part of that, I think, as you
Interesting.
mentioned, is music videos. But I also wonder, is part of it with Spotify having a bit more of a close link to radio play and just things that were popular on the radio at the time? Like, for instance, a song like Google Doll's Iris that was on Spotify's list is not on YouTube's list. I don't necessarily think the song had
Right.
like a memorable music video necessarily, but I think it's the audio of it. It makes people think of, you know, what was that movie that it was in? I'm trying to remember the movie that it was in. It'll come to me, but it was in a movie.
Wait, which song?
Spotify's Google Doll, or not Spot Google Doll's Iris. There was some 90s
Oh,
movie
yeah,
that it was
yeah.
in. I'm drawing a blank on it right now. Oh, City of Angels. So it was in that, and
Mm.
then, but I just don't think that people like recognize the music video they would. Like, it wasn't necessarily this big like TRL hit the way that like a boy band song was.
Right. Yeah, no, I noticed the same thing where looking over Spotify's list, it felt very much like just a list of every radio hit of the past 10 or 20 years, that it was really, really tied to that. And I wonder, like, this kind of brings me to another thing that I wanted to talk to you about with this, which is how my sort of theory with another reason that these are different is that Spotify's list is more of an accurate reflection of what the passive majority listens to, whereas YouTube is more of a reflection of what people are actively fans of and actively engaging with. Which is interesting because that was a question that we asked in our last episode where we were like, how do we measure, like, what are new ways to measure consumption? And I said, well, it'd be interesting if we could actually measure, active consumption versus passive. And now here, looking at these two lists, I was like, oh, this is actually potentially an example of that. And the other reason that came to me is because at MIDiA we've recently done a report on looking at different types of entertainment and how much of consumption is in the background of another activity versus focused. And YouTube, like people that watch music videos on YouTube are much more likely to be doing that as a focused activity in the foreground rather than something in the background, which makes sense because it's visual. There's social features to it, etc. Whereas they're a lot more likely to just put on their Spotify music in the background of something else. So I wonder if that's also part of the reason that Spotify seems to have more of a tie to radio and those songs that were just kind of popular for everyone, whereas YouTube is more what are the songs and artists and videos that people are like engaging with more
That's a good
actively.
point. And it makes me think, well, on the YouTube side, I'm much more likely to listen to a let a YouTube playlist run, right? Like I normally don't do that when I'm watching YouTube. I know YouTube has playlists, but I'm more likely to put a Spotify playlist on, which speaks to that. And I
Yeah,
know some of the stuff that you've
same.
researched and the team has researched at MIDiA as well is just this whole nature of probably a bit more on the digital stream provider side, but how to measure active versus passive engagement of or actually listening to a song. And maybe this is a closer way to get a gauge for that because, especially when these artists have these big week sales that'll come out and we'll see the numbers come through, it would be great to know, okay, how many people said, yes, I want to listen to this Taylor Swift song from
Right.
the Midnight's album, as opposed to people being like, oh, it just happened to be what's dominating today's top hits. Or if I'm listening to, the number 50 or the top 50 songs in the US, these are the ones that happen to play.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I think the other reason why Spotify's list probably is more tied to radio is because it's a lot more like the user base is less international than YouTube's, because that was the biggest difference looking at the two lists, was just how few internet like non-Western artists there were on Spotify's Billions Club versus
That stuck
YouTube's.
out too. And I think YouTube as well also had a list of who the artists that had the most billion views club songs were. And artists like
Yeah.
Ozuna were high up on that list. I want to say he had at least 10 videos on YouTube that hit a billion, but on Spotify, it's far less. I think J Balvin was another one too, where there was a big discrepancy there. And yeah, I think the fact that YouTube has had much more of a market share and in general listenership in these regions outside of, US and Western Europe as opposed to YouTube. So maybe part of that is like where
Um,
it's a signal of like, okay, this is where Spotify's clearly trying to grow and has been trying to get more share in. So like if Spotify achieved its goal, then it likely would have more of that and vice versa.
right. And then if is YouTube a sort of a more accurate representation of like what the music landscape of the future looks like in that way, where it will be less dominated probably by Western artists, as streaming sort of infiltrates all these other places. And that is so interesting for like the fragmentation conversation that we've been having, because it means things are just further fractured, and there's going to be lots of artists and songs on these lists that we've probably never heard of. Like it was so interesting to me, because part of the like excitement that I had to do this little project of like opening the two and comparing them was I was excited to be surprised. I was like, I want to see what things are on the list that I'm like, I have never heard of that, or what is that? How did that end up here? And I did not have that moment once looking at Spotify's playlist, but looking at YouTube's, there were so many videos and so many artists that I just had never heard of. And that was exciting to me. So I wonder how much that's a product of YouTube specifically versus that being what will happen inevitably when streaming is more
And were
widespread
most of the
globally.
surprises that you had, were most of them from an international perspective, or were there any Western based music surprises?
Um, that's a good question. There were definitely a handful of Western ones that I can't think of right now, but the majority were probably just artists I'd never heard of, or songs. Yeah, artists I didn't know anything about, that had billions and billions of views. Um, Yeah, I don't know. Let me think about that.
Yeah,
I don't
while you're thinking
remember.
about that, one thing that stuck out to me was there were certain artists that I think surprised me both in a way of, oh, I thought there would have been more here, or there were actually a bit less
Okay.
here. One artist is Justin Bieber. So I know that Justin Bieber is very popular, but if you would have asked me who were the biggest artists of the 2010s, I probably would name four names, maybe even five names before I named his name. But if you look at, even if you're just looking at Western artists, the artist that is the one with the most songs on Spotify and the one that I believe has the most songs on YouTube as well, Justin Bieber is in the top three of both of those lists. I believe it's at least 9 songs on Spotify and at least maybe 10 or so on YouTube. And there's something about that fandom that I didn't necessarily, I mean, I knew that he was huge. I knew that there were so many songs that were quite popular, especially the album that had like Sorry and Love Yourself. Like that one was huge, but I thought
Hmm.
that there were other artists, like for instance, an artist like Beyonce or even someone like Taylor Swift, who I don't believe that Beyonce had a song on the YouTube list at all, or a song that's really close to that. And at least up to now, I don't think that Taylor Swift has a song on Spotify's billions list. I think that Blank Space will probably get there eventually, but I don't think she has a song this moment that's on that list. So to see the two of them, who I think a lot of people largely think are two of the largest musicians in of the past decade, but to see someone like Bieber just have hit after hit on both of these lists, I
That's
was
so
like,
cool.
wow.
That's so interesting. Oh, the Justin Bieber conundrum of all of this. No, I okay, I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think so he was sort of made on YouTube, right? That's where he started posting clips, that's where he was discovered. And I think something else that this ties into that I wanted to bring up is how with YouTube, the artists that reach these billion views club, I think probably are more likely to have sort of built a community on YouTube, which Justin Bieber did, and that was kind of like the roots of his fandom. So when I was reading the YouTube's like blog about the Billion Views Club, and there were a bunch of artist quotes, and a lot of them had to do with the artist saying, like YouTube was a place to build a community. And Alan Walker was one of the artists who said that, and he was someone who he's a electronic music artist who, when I was looking at the YouTube Billions Views Club, he came up again and again, and I was like, it seemed random to me because he's a great artist, he has a big community of fans, but I just didn't think that he would have billions of views. But he seems to credit the community aspect for that. So I think that could be part of it. But then as soon as you said, oh, but he's also one of the top artists on Spotify, I'm like, okay, but that's a completely different story because there's no community building on Spotify. So is it just that the fans are that obsessed with the music that they're, maybe migrating over and streaming there as well? Or are we just misremembering, how big of an impact Justin Bieber had? And then that brought me to thinking about how, I mean, I think this relates to Taylor as well, but they both built their fan bases at a time when things were just kind of a lot less congested. So I think it was in many ways easier to get a billion views or billion streams on something a couple years ago than it is now that people's tastes are so fragmented. So maybe that's also part of the reason why, like, I wonder how many of those streams came from, pre 2015 or something versus from then on. I wonder when they were accumulated. So yeah, that's sort of my rant of thoughts and to
The point
respond to
about
that.
Bieber is a good one because I didn't think about that, but I think it's absolutely right. He was doing all those cover songs of all these other artists when he's like a
Yeah.
teenager. He's growing the base there. And to the point that you had brought up in an article a couple months ago, we talked about the last time we were on the podcast, he is in a different category than someone like a Beyonce or Taylor Swift. Like when Taylor made Teardrops on my guitar, I don't even like that was probably around the same time that YouTube started. Like in some ways, her fandom predated so much of what people know as music. And of course, Beyonce became a solo artist from Destiny's Child well before YouTube even started. So I think that's a good point there with some of it. The Spotify thing, though, is interesting. Yeah, I mean, they're likely, I think those songs did get a lot of radio play as well. Like everything off of that album, that Bieber's album, that Sorry came on as well, I think got a ton of radio plays. So that ties into the Spotify piece of it too. And maybe a little bit of misremembering of certain things of well. And, you know, like I'm a little bit older than the
Yeah.
Justin Bieber demo. So there could be some of it there where they may not hit me in the same circles that the same way that, you know, someone did with Beyonce or for instance.
Yeah. I have another thought related to this that I feel like I'm struggling to articulate, but I'm going to try, which is that on on the Spotify list and the YouTube list, I thought there was more overlap when it came to which older artists were on the list than there was when it comes to newer artists. And I wonder if that is also sort of further proof of this fragmentation that's happening, because it would make sense that if a decade ago, 2 decades ago, people kind of had less to choose from to listen to, everybody kind of has the same favorite artists from those decades that they've listened to enough to reach a billion streams. Yet now that people have more choice and things are fragmented more, their favorite artists and songs today are more varied.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's something there
Does
because
that
if
make
you think
sense?
about it, the lists are quite similar. And I think even if you look at YouTube's list, which I think even though YouTube's list is less reliant on radio, the biggest songs they have from the 80s and 90s are still the same songs that people have heard in bars and in
Me too.
stadiums and in TV commercials for decades now. So there's consistency there. Things do start to get a
Right.
bit segmented to your point of where things are right now. So both of these platforms in many ways enable the fragmentation of fandom. Their algorithms made it easy for people to have their own circles. So I do think that that piece of it is true. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah. Okay, I'm glad I could put that into words, because it was one of those things where I had this thought and was like, does this make sense?
Yeah. Oh
But
yeah.
yeah,
Another
fascinating.
thing too that stuck out. This stuck out a bit more on Spotify's playlist than others, but how certain songs have shifted from when radio, for instance, was more playing songs that I think people more often wanted to hear in their cars. But Spotify, it's on demand, it's everywhere. I think, for instance, workout music is something that we've seen a pretty large uptick on with Spotify. A song like Eminem's Till I Collapse, which is in the billions playlist for Spotify. I don't think I heard that song once on the radio. Maybe I'm misremembering things just relative to how big Eminem's hits were in the early 2000s. But that song is one of his most played songs. And I think it's because it's a song that a lot of guys listen to when they want to work out. Maybe it's something that they also will play on, like, I don't think they play to like LA Fitness necessarily, like on the speakers, but I think it's more so of like a, no, let me go listen to this while I try to, you know, set a PR on the bench press or whatever.
Totally.
So I feel like there's things like that. Also, seasonal music, right? Of course, just Mariah Carey and some of the records and accolades that All I Want for Christmas Is You has continued to reach, and all of the remixes and versions she's done of that song. Like, that doesn't happen without
September
streaming, right?
was on there. I was gonna say, September
Yes.
was also on there, which, every September everybody starts to that is a
Yep.
seasonal song. So, yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I also noticed that both lists had a lot of, like, upbeat music, like what you're saying, like, stuff that people work out to, and I feel like it's for different reasons. Like, on Spotify, maybe those types of songs dominate because, like you're saying, they're the things that people put on in the background of something, whereas, on YouTube, the reason might be because those tend to have more vibrant videos. Like, I feel like more people are likely to watch videos for, an upbeat reggaeton song than like some acoustic, I don't know, Taylor Swift song, even though she's a massive star, like overall, you know? And on that note, I don't know if this is just my, anecdotal takeaway. You'd have to, again, like, actually go through all the songs and do some data crunching, but I felt like Spotify had actually more varied, um in terms of, like, upbeat songs were on there, but also a lot of Coldplay, a lot of, like, earlier Ed Sheeran, like those more, like, uh not so upbeat, more acoustic songs, whereas YouTube didn't barely had any of those because again, I think they're maybe more less likely to be something people watch the video of. I don't know, but that was interesting. Just the how up tempo the
Yeah.
two lists
I
were.
would need to go back and check to see if like a song like Coldplay Yellow is that on YouTube's list.
Yeah,
I mean, I know it's a
it's on Spotify's, but I don't think
yeah,
it's on
and that would speak
YouTube's.
to that point, right? It's a more somber video. I'm pretty sure Chris Martin's head is laying like sideways on
Right.
the pavement in that video, right? Or on the bed, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, it's just not going to
Right.
be as, I think, yes, like if you have 5 minutes, like this is the thing that I want to be able to get to. So, yeah, it's such a fascinating
Right.
distinction. And I think with it, it's clear that with both of these platforms, the two of them are really trying to compete more and more with each other, with both Spotify trying to get more and more international, YouTube trying to have more and more influence just in terms of the overall revenue that they generate for the industry. So I do want to talk about the two of them as companies distinctly. But before we get there, I
Yeah.
think that the international piece and just how revenue is generated for each of these streams or each of these views will be an interesting distinction over time because, especially with Spotify, these streams that the artists are generating don't necessarily get weighted the same in terms of the pro rata and the pools that they get put into and then getting separated. So,
Right.
if one artist has a bunch of streams from a bunch of their fans, but a lot of their fans are in places where the subscriptions cost $2 per month to subscribe to Spotify, or there's a over index of free accounts versus paid. Like these numbers don't necessarily reflect that, which is fine. I think we're just trying to get a gauge for what listening looks like. But the revenue may actually look very different for, let's say, thinking about like one of these, 80s or 90s radio hits, the person that's listening to that account may be more likely to be paying 10 or maybe soon $11 a month for a Spotify subscription if I'm just thinking about what that consumer may be like, and therefore essentially getting more revenue per stream than some of the newer artists that may have a younger or more
Yeah.
international fan base. So that was another point that I thought was interesting. We won't have that data, but just based on inference, I feel like that's a trend in terms of where it's going.
Yeah. No, I that makes sense. And I also wonder if like if short form video becomes the more dominant form of consuming video and the people that are watching music videos on YouTube shift to watching 30-second videos that use music on shorts, like what will that do to the revenue mix? And it'll also depend on if the way that UGC platforms pay out to the music industry changes, where it's no longer this blanket payment for uses and is more per use. I think there's a lot that could get shifted around there, and I wonder if like how does that change how does that mean YouTube is sort of cannibalizing its own one of its own sources where people that are watching music videos are now going to shorts instead, or is there like I think there's an opportunity for both, but I guess these are just questions that come up in my mind when
Yeah,
I'm
it's
thinking about
like in
this.
some ways it's similar to when Instagram adds stories, right? You're trying to get a sense, is this additive or is this going to take away? And I think YouTube's goal
Like
is
what they
that
already have,
it would
right?
be additive. But you're bringing up, I think, a valid thing where it's a little different with music and how you're registering streams. And I do think that there's a certain number of people that the better and better that shorts get, there's going to be less desire to go check out the actual video. And if these songs aren't registering, I think at least for a stream or a view, it's 30 seconds of listening needs to be registered at least to be counted as a stream. Then if that doesn't happen on a short and you're just getting these clips, then how does that impact the actual artist themselves?
Right. No, you put it really well. Like the better that shorts gets, the more it might actually threaten people going to YouTube to watch the
Yeah,
videos.
so many
Interesting.
interesting, I think, things to just dive into with this. But I think it's a good point to
Yeah.
just talk more broadly about Spotify and YouTube in general, just in terms of where they are, how both of them want the other one. And I think based on these blog posts and based on a number of the letters that the emails that you'll see from Leor Cohen when he's describing where things are with YouTube. There's clearly a goal to, establish itself as the leader in the market. And I think the growth is been pretty strong. But of course, Spotify, I think still with nearly 200 million paid subscribers is definitely, I think leading on that front. But where do you see this play out in terms of whether or not the trends and clearly what these playlists tell us about the tendencies of these two companies and also where things are going and who we think will be more or less dominant, let's say 5 years from now? Let's not say 10 years. I think that's a bit too far out, but let's say 5 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've written about this. I've written a couple of blogs about this, but I think that YouTube does have a lot of advantages, especially for just where the music landscape is going. So, one is that, in the streaming world, there's so little differentiation, right? All of the DSPs kind of offer the same experience, the same catalog, the same price. But YouTube actually has a differentiating factor in that it's an audiovisual platform and that they also have shorts, and they kind of have this ecosystem of apps that feed into each other. And that's sort of the second advantage, is that ecosystem aspect where, you know, fans are, based on our data, new generations of fans are really looking for more ways to actively participate in fandom, and not just listen to a song but create content around it. And Spotify has that. It has, I mean, sorry, YouTube has that. It has this creator proposition. In many ways, YouTube was the first, arguably the first, creator platform, the first place that you could post video content online and build a career around it. So fans want this, but also artists need more ways to directly engage with their fans and monetize, and actually not just be discovered, but sustain fandom and build communities. And that's the thing that I think so many social platforms lack, is they can help artists get discovered, but it's still really hard for them to connect the dots. So when you have YouTube, if you think about like the journey of a fan through the ecosystem, maybe they discover a song on Shorts and they can actually just click it and go straight to the artist's YouTube page, where maybe they watch the video that just came out, and then they can go to YouTube Music and stream the song, and it kind of creates this more frictionless experience. So I think we're already seeing a lot of consumers spend more of their music time on platforms that let them play around with the music, like the TikToks of the world and the shorts of the world. So if you have an ecosystem that combines that with streaming and the ability to just go seamlessly from one to the other, I think that's really powerful. And that's also why, ByteDance launching a streaming service could really change the game. I think ByteDance and YouTube have a lot of the same advantages in that space. So I think YouTube is well positioned for the current era and what both artists are looking for and what fans are looking for, I guess, is how I would frame
Yeah,
that.
I think that YouTube's biggest advantage with this is that it still is under a much larger company that prints money from search, which is
Yeah.
Google, right? So
Yeah.
the fact that it in itself is the second largest search engine, largely because of Google, I think that piece of it will serve well. And I think secondly, the fact that when there's so many more things competing for your attention, whatever can make that have less friction and can make it easier for people to access that platform, as we've seen based on the rise of TikTok, I think those platforms do tend to win out in this area where you're ultimately trying to either capture or monetize attention. And the way that streaming is going, even though I know it can be lucrative for artists that own their assets or have favorable terms, it is a bit more of a measure of capturing attention for a lot of artists and being able to essentially market and position themselves out there to share what they have so that they can monetize elsewhere. And I do think that, I know I've talked about this previously, but just Spotify may be in a little bit more of a difficult position, just given the fact that its ultimate goal is still to try to get more monetization from its non-music audio, whether it's your podcast or your audiobooks and stuff like that. And I think that is a little bit of a tougher bet relative to YouTube trying to go with shorts and essentially trying to compete more directly with TikTok or just other things in general that are making it easier. That said, I still think that Spotify
Mhm.
is more strong from a product perspective of actually being able to, ease of use of listening, being able to find and skip to the song and being able to listen to a song on my phone, um, you know, turning off the screen and then putting it in my pocket. And I know that YouTube does now allow you essentially to do that if you pay for a subscription, but I think the friction, at least in the consumer's mind, is a little different than it is with doing that with Spotify, even because you do that with Spotify for a free account, especially. So I do think that there are some pros and cons there. But to your point, I do think that because YouTube is moving more in the direction of creating less friction for people to use its product and just the fact that it's visual, it's engaged, and to your other point, it's a bit more directly connected to fans being able to actively choose what they want to listen to, like the data and all those things are going to be more impactful and insightful there.
Right. Right. So I think artists will kind of go to wherever the fans and the remuneration opportunities are. And I think YouTube is right now providing more of that than Spotify is. Like Spotify is a place where you can monetize scale, but you can't monetize niche. And YouTube is an ecosystem where you can monetize both. And I think there's no reason why streaming services in general shouldn't be a place where you can monetize both, but we haven't really seen that happen yet. And I think YouTube is moving in that direction. So I guess when I come at this question because of the work that I do from such a perspective of what do the artists and the fans want. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that um, that alone isn't going to, make YouTube overtake Spotify. So I guess I'm a little bit biased just based on the work that I do.
Yeah, I could see that because there's just so many factors at play here. It's such a dominant position. And at the end of
Totally.
the day, nearly 200 million people in the world are paying for the service. And that is much higher than a lot of these other services. And there's something to be said for
Mhm.
that. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, though.
Yeah.
I feel like to some of the points you brought up earlier, just going back to the Billions Club, if we had this conversation 2 years from now, it'd be interesting to see one, which old songs creep back up and which songs that have come out recently end up rising up and hitting those places and does it line up
Yeah.
with a lot of the points that we brought up here. So I'm excited to see what that looks like.
No, me too. And also what the pace will be. Like, will there be just way more songs that have hit a billion streams in a shorter amount of time, or will the opposite trend happen because of fragmentation? Like, I'm not really sure. So yeah, as always, excited to see what
Definitely.
comes next.
Well, Tati, this was great. Thanks for coming to share these insights. And I think now I got to go back and count how many crazy frog videos there were on YouTube's list because when I saw that, I'm glad you brought that up. I was just like, my goodness, I forgot all about this trend.
Yeah. At least in that ratio, we have a confirmed
Yeah.
YouTube wins.
All right. Well, before we let you go, what do you have coming down the pipeline? Are there any upcoming research or any recent things that you've put out that listeners should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I would say coming up, one of my favorite things that we do at MIDiA is our predictions report, where every year at the end of the year we put out predictions for the coming year, and we also rate ourselves in terms of how much we got right from the past year. I believe our success rate is somewhere above 80%, so
That's legit.
that's great. But yeah, so we always do. I believe we always do a free webinar on that. It was free last year. So look out for that because it's a great chance to interact with us, even if you're not a client. And
Awesome.
it's a lot of
Well,
fun.
no, we'll look out for that. And yeah, we'll have to see. I'm curious what the hit rate will be this year. So definitely let us know what the success rate
Yeah,
is from the ones you made last year heading into this year. Awesome.
we
Well, thank
will.
you. This is great.